Seth and Jenny Becker run cattle on a piece of central Montana called Stick Leg Ranch, country so flat and so far from any mountain that for the better part of a century, nobody out there gave bears a second thought. One morning, the Beckers climbed a ridge above a coulee on their own deeded land, lifted a pair of binoculars, and started counting holes dug into the canyon rim. They stopped at eight grizzly bear dens on a cattle ranch. In country, every map in the state still colors as wheat and grass and nothing with claws. They hadn't gone looking for this. They found it after their 9-year-old son nearly walked face to face with a grizzly behind their own house. That should not be possible. Stick Leg Ranch sits nowhere near Glacier, nowhere near the Bob Marshall, nowhere near the wild country where Americans have been trained for 100 years to expect this animal. It sits out on the open prairie, the kind of land where the nearest peak is a smudge on the horizon if you can see it at all. And yet 8 bears, or 8 different years of one bear, or some combination nobody has fully sorted out yet, have been quietly digging in for the winter within walking distance of the Beckers' kitchen window. It would be a strange story if it were the only one. It isn't. Up and down the seam where the Rocky Mountain front gives way to open ground, Choteau, Valier, Augusta, Dupuyer, the grain country around Conrad and Power, Montanans are running into an animal their grandparents never planned for. A landowner east of Choteau shot a charging grizzly a mile from town while picking mushrooms, not realizing until the bear was on top of him that anything bigger than a deer lived out there anymore. Ranchers along the front have started fencing grain bins with electrified mats, because bears have learned to lean a shoulder into a steel door until the latch gives. Families are finding bear tracks across irrigation ditches 2 and 3 counties removed from the nearest forest boundary. In October of 2023, a trail camera on a ranch near the Judith River, more than 100 miles east of the mountains and just upstream from where that river meets the Missouri, caught a grizzly bear walking through frame. It was the first confirmed grizzly on that stretch of prairie in over a decade, and by some counts, the farthest east one had been documented in 100 years. The wildlife manager who reviewed the footage put it about as plainly as a biologist can. There is nobody alive in central Montana who remembers the last time a grizzly bear was seen on that ground. Here's the part of the story almost everyone gets backwards, and it's worth pausing on before going any further, because the rest of this only makes sense once you understand it. The grizzly bear is not a mountain animal. It never was. Ursus arctos horribilis is a brown bear, the North American branch of the same species that roams the open steppe of Russia and Kazakhstan, the tundra of Scandinavia, the grasslands of Central Asia. Brown bears the world over are animals of open country as much as forest. In North America, before European settlement, the Grizzlies range ran from the Pacific coast across the deserts and mountains and out onto the Great Plains, reaching as far as the Mississippi in places, down through what is now Texas and into northern Mexico. Federal wildlife biologists estimate something on the order of 50,000 grizzlies once occupied that range, spread across portions of 18 western states. They were thickest in the Rocky Mountains and along the upper Missouri River drainage, but thickest in the mountains is not the same as confined to the mountains, and the historical record makes that distinction unmistakable. When Lewis and Clark pushed their keelboats up the Missouri in 1805, they were nowhere near a mountain when they met their first grizzly. Open prairie near present-day Fort Peck Reservoir in eastern Montana. Hundreds of miles from the Rockies. It wasn't their last. The expedition's journals record bear encounters at more than a dozen points along that stretch of river, almost all of them on the plains, and most of the grizzlies the party killed on the whole journey died there. Not in the mountains they hadn't reached yet. The animal terrified them. One bull took multiple rifle balls and kept coming. Lewis wrote that he'd rather face 2 warriors in battle than one of these bears. The legends remember the same geography. Hugh Glass, the trapper whose mauling became the basis for The Revenant, was attacked not in some alpine pass, but on the open prairie of what is now northwestern South Dakota, river-bottom grassland that looked nothing like the mountains the film later put around him. Plains tribes from the Dakotas down through Nebraska and Kansas lived alongside these bears for thousands of years before any of that ground was called Montana. The pattern held closer to home, too. In the fall of 1947, a Montana rancher's sheepherder was nearly killed by a marauding grizzly working the foothill pastures along the North Fork of the Dearborn River, the exact stretch of prairie edge country outside Augusta, where bears are turning up on trail cameras again today. Same animal, same kind of ground, 2 generations apart. A caveat, because the honest version of this story is more interesting than the exaggerated one. Those plains grizzlies were never spread evenly across the whole short grass sea, like some uniform population of buffalo. Federal range data describes them as less common across large stretches of true desert and high plains, concentrated instead along the rivers, the brushy creek bottoms, the chokecherry draws, the places where berries grew, and where the carcasses of drowned bison and elk piled up after spring floods. The grizzly was a creature of the green seams threading through the grassland, not a creature of open grass for its own sake, but along those seams, the entire length of the northern plains. The bear was home. What happened to it next is not the story most people were taught. The grizzly did not retreat to the mountains looking for sanctuary, the way a refugee flees toward shelter. It was shot, trapped, and poisoned out of the lowlands as homesteaders converted the river bottoms into wheat fields and the open range into fenced cattle country. The bears that survived were simply the ones living in terrain too steep, too remote, and too useless for agriculture to be worth clearing of predators. The high country was never the grizzly's preferred address. It was its hiding place. The image of the grizzly as lord of the high peaks is an accident of which populations happen to be hardest to kill. By the time anyone formally counted, the damage was almost total. Federal biologists estimate the grizzly had been pushed out of roughly 98% of its range south of Canada by the 1930s. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the species as threatened in 1975, the entire lower 48 held somewhere between 700 and 800 bears, squeezed into a handful of parks and wilderness areas in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington. The Northern Continental Divide population, anchored around Glacier and the Bob Marshall, was down to a fraction of even that. And then, slowly, across 50 years of federal protection, the line started moving the other direction. The Northern Continental Divide grizzly population has climbed to somewhere above 1,100 bears. Montana's statewide estimate now sits north of 2,000, more than half of every grizzly in the contiguous United States. A range-wide genetic study released by federal and state biologists in December 2025 found the species' occupied territory across the lower 48 had grown roughly 4% in 2 years, covering nearly 59,000 square miles, more than 34,000 of those inside Montana alone. The Northern Continental Divide population's occupied range grew about 12% in that same window, now covering essentially the entire recovery zone it was assigned in 1975 and pushing beyond it. A recovered predator population does what every recovered population eventually does. It runs out of room, and when it runs out of room in the mountains, the only direction left to go is back down, out onto the ground its ancestors never actually left behind for good. They were just driven out of it. There's a biological mechanism behind this, and it isn't mysterious. Female grizzlies invest 2 to 3 years raising a litter before breeding again. And when young bears strike out on their own, the established core ranges are already full of resident adults. Newcomers, especially young males, get pushed to the margins, the low foothills, the front country ranches, the river breaks. At the same time, one of the high country's most reliable late summer food sources, the fat, rich seed of the whitebark pine has been collapsing for decades under disease, beetle kill, and a warming climate. Fewer pine nuts in September means more bears scattered farther afield looking for calories. And on the prairie side of the mountains, calories are easy. Spilled grain, alfalfa, choke cherries, carrion, the occasional beehive. None of this looks like an invasion from the bears' side of it. It looks like an old commute reopening. The hardest part of measuring this return is that the bears doing it are nearly impossible to see. A grizzly doesn't cross open wheat ground at noon. It moves at night, threading the cottonwood bottoms along the rivers, the brushy fence-line draws, the shelter belts planted between fields a century ago to stop the topsoil from blowing away, the same green corridors its ancestors used to move through this exact country long before anyone called it farmland. A bear can bed down in willow brush 2 miles from an occupied farmhouse and never be seen. That Judith River bear had apparently crossed more than 100 miles of settled agricultural land, including the Rocky Mountain front itself, without a single confirmed sighting along the way. Nobody clocked it crossing a single road. The real number of bears out on the plains right now is therefore almost certainly a floor, not a ceiling. Wildlife agencies can only confirm what gets photographed, tracked, or run into. And a species built to disappear into brush at first light is going to underreport itself by a wide margin in country this empty. Here is the detail that turns this from a handful of wandering strays into something closer to a resettlement. And it's the same detail the Beckers stumbled onto above their own coulee. Females are denning and raising cubs out on the prairie, not just passing through it. A young, dispersing male covering new ground is one kind of story. Interesting, but temporary. A female digging a den into a canyon wall and bringing cubs into the world, there's a different kind of story entirely. It means that stretch of ground isn't a corridor anymore, it's a home range. 8 dens on one ranch isn't 8 transient bears. It's evidence of years of repeat use, possibly multiple bears, possibly the same female returning to the same general country season after season the way grizzlies are known to do. That's where the skeptical question has to be taken seriously, because it's fair. Is this actually a return, or just a few unlucky, displaced animals that agencies will eventually trap or remove until the prairie goes quiet again? The data doesn't support the quiet prairie version. Relocations of conflict bears in Montana nearly tripled between 2023 and 2024. Verified sightings around Lewistown, nowhere near classic bear habitat a decade ago, numbered in the high single digits in a single year, alongside actual conflicts on top of that. And breeding females denning on open ground is functionally the opposite of a stray population. Strays don't reproduce where they stop. Residents do. The honest obstacle in this story was never the habitat. Federal biologists have said for years that the prairie can feed grizzlies just fine. It fed 50,000 of them once. The obstacle is us, and it shows up in 2 very different forms. The first is concrete and physical, interstates. In December of 2025, Montana wildlife officials confirmed a grizzly in the Bangtail Mountains east of Bozeman, the first documented bear in that range in decades. To get there, that bear almost certainly had to cross or pass beneath Interstate 90, 4 lanes of traffic running close to 80 miles an hour, a barrier that kills a meaningful share of every grizzly that attempts it. Biologists now talk seriously about wildlife crossings and underpasses as the only realistic way to let 2 of the state's major bear populations, one centered on Glacier, one on Yellowstone, eventually reconnect genetically, something that hasn't happened naturally in 100 years. The second obstacle is political, and it's playing out in real time on the same stretch of prairie this story is about. A nonprofit called American Prairie has spent more than 2 decades buying up ranch land in north-central Montana to rewild more than 3 million acres. Bison, prairie dogs, eventually grizzlies and wolves. The group didn't release any bears onto that ground. It didn't need to. The Judith River trail camera grizzly walked onto American Prairie's property entirely on its own, the same way it crossed everyone else's land to get there. But the project has become a genuine flashpoint. Cattle ranchers between Lewistown and Malta have put up roadside signs reading, "Save the cowboy, stop American Prairie Reserve." It's the whole argument in miniature, an animal moving back into ground that was always partly its own, and a human landscape rearranged so completely around its absence that the return now reads as a hostile act instead of a homecoming. It would be dishonest to end this without the caveat the data demands, because the romantic version of this story overshoots the truth. This is not a prairie suddenly thick with grizzlies. By most working estimates, it's closer to 70 or 80 bears scattered across the advancing edge of farm country. Most still tucked into river bottoms within striking distance of the mountains, rather than roaming the open grass between. And despite the imagery, these bears mostly aren't coming for cattle. Montana's own bear managers describe grizzlies as poor hunters of adult livestock compared to wolves or mountain lions, opportunists drawn far more often to spilled grain, garden fruit, beehives, carrion, and unsecured trash than to a healthy cow. That doesn't mean livestock losses aren't real. A 2-year-old male relocated out of the Potomac area in 2025 after killing sheep was shot 2 weeks later near Condon after charging a different landowner. One bear, 2 ranches, a hard reminder that relocation doesn't always solve the underlying conflict. Bears have been lethally removed near the Gravelly Mountains and in the Paradise Valley for the same reason. The conflict is real, even if the headline version of it, grizzlies as cattle-killing machines sweeping the plains, isn't. The accurate claim is narrower than the myth, and stranger, an animal almost every American pictures as a creature of high, wild mountains was never that animal to begin with. It was a creature of river bottoms and open ground, erased from the prairie within 2 or 3 human lifetimes, by bounty hunters and homesteaders who saw it as an obstacle to wheat and cattle, and it has spent the last 50 years, unassisted and unannounced, working its way back out of the only ground left for it to hide in. Nobody released these bears onto the prairie. No agency planned this, and no rewilding group engineered it, whatever the fight over American Prairie's fences might suggest. A protected population simply filled up the mountains it had been confined to and started spilling back downhill into the grasslands and river bottoms that were always part of its range, doing exactly what every recovering predator population does when it runs out of room. So this ends where it started, on a ridge above a coulee on a working cattle ranch, with 2 ranchers counting den holes they never expected to find on their own land. The bears living down in that canyon were not lost, and they were not invaders. They were doing what their kind did along these exact rivers for thousands of years before anyone decided this ground belonged to wheat and cattle and nothing else. They came back the only way an animal that size can come back into country, this open, quietly, at night, up the brush along the creek bottoms, into the grain bins and the choke cherry draws, while nobody was watching closely enough to notice until a 9-year-old boy walked around the corner of his own house and found one waiting there. The mountains were never the grizzlies' whole country. They were just the last place left standing when everywhere else was taken from it. And out past the wheat fields, in the dark beyond the porch light, on ground nobody alive remembers it occupying, the bear is shuffling back onto the prairie it never actually wanted to leave.